My family had a rule that no one ever said out loud, keep the peace, no matter what it costs you. It wasn't written anywhere. It didn't need to be. It lived in the way my mother changed the subject whenever my sister walked into a room mid-argument. It lived in the way my father topped off my sister's wine glass before she even asked. It lived in the silence they expected from me, steady, accommodating, invisible. I was the kind of daughter who paid her own way through law school, passed the bar on the first attempt, and accepted a position at the U.S. Attorney's office in Charlotte at 28 without throwing a party or expecting a parade. My sister Danielle was the kind of daughter who borrowed money she never paid back and got a standing ovation for showing up on time. My name is Claire, I'm 31 years old, and the worst thing that ever happened to me started with a phone call I answered out of love. My mother called on a Tuesday in February. She had a calm voice, the kind she reserved for things that weren't actually calm. Your father's having the knee surgery Friday, she said. We could really use you here for a few weeks. Just until he's mobile again. I had 3 active federal cases on my desk, a deposition scheduled for the following Thursday, and a supervisor who did not believe in the concept of personal emergencies. But I looked at my calendar, looked at my lease, and said yes. I took family medical leave, packed 2 weeks' worth of clothes into a duffel bag, drove 4 hours to Greensboro, where I grew up in a split-level house with beige carpets and a doorbell that played a song nobody remembered choosing. Danielle was already there when I arrived. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of white wine and a smile that said she was pleased with the arrangement. Hey, sis. Look at you, actually showing up. I set my bag down and told her it was good to see her. I meant it, which was probably my first mistake. The first few days were routine. I helped my father with his medication schedule. I drove my mother to the grocery store. I made dinner while Danielle sat on the couch watching reality television and offering it. She had moved back home 8 months earlier, after what my mother vaguely described as a difficult period. I didn't ask for details. I'd learned not to. Danielle was 34, 3 years older than me, and had spent most of her adult life adjacent to success. She worked part-time at a local marketing firm, or she had been the details shifted depending on who was telling the story. My parents had given her what they called a loan 2 years earlier, $40,000. There was no repayment schedule. There was no written agreement. There was just a transfer and a silence so comfortable everyone pretended the money was a gift. I had never borrowed $1 from them, not once. Not because I was proud I was, but that wasn't the reason. It was because I had watched what borrowing did to Danielle. It turned her into something permanent in that house, a fixture. A child who never had to finish growing up because the house kept catching her. By the end of the first week, I noticed things. Small things at first. My laptop had been moved. Not dramatically, just a few inches, the way someone moves something when they've been using it and don't want you to know. I mentioned it to my mother, who said I was probably tired from the drive. Then I noticed my leather portfolio was in the guest room closet instead of on the desk where I'd left it. Inside it was a pad of yellow legal paper with some of the top sheets missing. When I asked Danielle about it, she laughed. Why would I touch your boring lawyer stuff? You think everything's a crime. She said it like a joke, but her eyes didn't participate. I let it go. That was the habit of 28 years. Let it go, smooth it over, keep the peace. Then came the bank notification. I was sitting in my father's room helping him with his physical therapy exercises, the leg lifts the doctor had prescribed, when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I almost ignored it, but the preview caught my eye. The message was from my bank. It read, "Your check number 1042 has cleared. Amount, $6,200. I had not written a check for $6,200. I had not written any checks since moving into an apartment 3 years ago that handled everything digitally. My checkbook was in my leather portfolio. My father was saying something about the physical therapist coming Thursday. I told him that was great and excused myself to the hallway, where I stood very still and read the notification 3 more times. Then I went to the guest room and opened my portfolio. The checkbook was there. But 2 checks were missing from the back of the pad, not the front, where a careless person might pull from, but the back, where the checks with the highest numbers lived. The kind of place you'd only look if you knew what you were doing. I walked to the kitchen. Danielle was refilling her glass. My mother was folding dish towels. I stood in the doorway and looked at my sister and said very quietly, "Did you take checks from my checkbook?" She turned around with an expression she'd clearly prepared. What? No, why would I do that? Because 2 are missing, and $6,000 just left my account. The dish towel dropped. My mother's face did something complicated. It went from surprise to a kind of rapid calculation I recognized. She was already running scenarios, already deciding what version of this she could live with. Danielle set her wine glass down. She did it slowly, like she was buying time. Claire, I was going to tell you. I want you to understand the specific quality of that sentence. Not I didn't do it. Not you must be wrong. She was going to tell me. Past tense future. The confession wrapped in the language of an intention that had never actually existed. I borrowed it, she said, just temporarily. I have a payment due on a loan that I couldn't miss, and I was going to pay you back before you even noticed. There it was, the sentence that rewrote reality, the one that turned theft into borrowing and crime into inconvenience. I told her she had used my name to write a check she did not have permission to write. That's forgery, Danielle. That's a federal offense. She laughed that sharp, disbelieving laugh she used whenever the world refused to accommodate her. Oh my God, you're so dramatic. It's not forgery, it's family. I was going to replace it. My mother stepped forward. Claire, honey, let's just calm down. She didn't mean any harm. She forged my signature, Mom. You don't know that it was your signature. I held up the checkbook. Check number 1042. I haven't written a check in 3 years. Someone went into my portfolio, took a check from the back of the pad, filled it out, signed my name, and deposited it. That's not a misunderstanding. My father called from the other room asking if everything was okay. My mother called back, yes, fine, just the girls talking. And that sentence, just the girls talking, landed somewhere in my chest like a thumbtack. I went to the guest room, called my bank, and began the process of disputing the transaction. The representative walked me through it patiently. I told her I suspected the check had been signed by someone other than me. She flagged it for fraud review and told me a specialist would contact me within 48 hours. When I came back downstairs, my mother was alone in the kitchen. Danielle had gone to her room. My mother looked at me with the expression she'd been perfecting since I was 7, the one that said, "Please don't make this hard." She's going through something, my mother said. She's been struggling, Claire. The loan didn't work out the way she planned. She's scared. I can't just throw her out into... I'm not asking you to throw her out. I'm asking you to acknowledge what she did. She sighed. You have a good job. You have savings. I know this isn't ideal, but maybe if you just... Don't, I said. She blinked. Do not finish that sentence. We stood there for a moment in the kitchen that smelled like dish soap and my father's medication and 20 years of things nobody said. Then my mother looked at the counter and said, I just think prosecuting your own sister is a little extreme. The word prosecuting. Like I had chosen this. Like I was the one who walked into someone's private documents and took what wasn't mine. I went to bed. I lay there on the guest room mattress that was slightly too soft and stared at the ceiling and thought about the way my mother had used that word. Not forging, not stealing, prosecuting. She had already assigned the villain, and it wasn't Danielle. The bank specialist called me the next morning. She confirmed that check 1042 had been presented at a branch in Greensboro in person, by a woman who had shown an ID to the teller. The handwriting on the check did not match the signature on file for my account. She walked me through my options and strongly advised me to file a police report to complete the fraud claim. I called the Greensboro Police Department from my car, parked in the driveway with the engine running. The officer who took my report was patient and thorough. He asked me to confirm the address of the residence where the suspected party was currently staying. I told him it was the same address where I was staying. He paused. That's going to be a domestic fraud situation, he said. Just so you're aware, those can get complicated. I told him I understood. I also told him I was a federal prosecutor and that I was aware of the process. There was a brief silence. He told me someone would follow up. I went back inside. My father was watching a morning news program from the recliner my mother had rented for his recovery. He looked at me when I sat down on the couch. He was a quiet man, had always been, and he used his silences the way other people used words. He looked at me for a long moment and then looked back at the television. I didn't know how much he knew. I didn't ask. Danielle came downstairs around 10. She was showered and composed, wearing the expression she put on when she expected a problem to have resolved itself overnight. She poured coffee, looked at me, and said, "So are we good?" I looked at her. No. Her jaw tightened. "Claire, I told you I'll pay it back. That's not the issue anymore." "What does that mean?" "I filed a police report this morning." The coffee mug went down on the counter harder than she intended. Are you serious? She came down the hall fast, voice rising. You called the police on your own sister? For what, over $6,000? For forging my signature on a check. Which is fraud. Which is a crime. You're ruining my life over money that would have been back in your account in 2 weeks. That's not the point, I said for what felt like the 100th time. But explaining the point to Danielle was like explaining weather to someone who had decided to be offended by rain. She didn't want to understand. She wanted me to absorb the consequence of what she'd done and call it love. My mother appeared at the top of the stairs. Her voice came down first. What is going on down there? Danielle gave her a summary that bore almost no resemblance to reality. Claire's having me arrested. My mother descended the stairs with her hand on the rail like she needed support. She's not having you arrested, my mother said, then looked at me. Right? You're not actually… She forged my signature, Mom. There's a process. I followed it. Can't you unfollow it? That question. I want you to sit with that question for a moment. Can you unfollow it? Like justice was a social media account. Like the law was a preference setting I could toggle off to make dinner more comfortable. I told her I could not. Danielle went back upstairs. My mother stood in the kitchen and looked at me like I had done something terrible, even though I was the one missing $6,000 and 2 checks with my name forged on them. That look was so familiar. I had been receiving it my entire life. Every time I didn't accommodate, every time I didn't smooth it over, every time I insisted that something real had happened. A detective contacted me 2 days later. He was professional and direct. Based on the bank's documentation, the teller's account, the ID presented, the check itself, there was enough to proceed. He asked if I wanted to press charges. I told him yes. He asked if I understood the charges might include check fraud and identity theft. I told him I did. The investigation moved with the specific kind of momentum that happens when the victim knows how the process works. I provided my complete contact information, my employer details, and the name of my supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's office, who had by then been briefed on the situation. She told me to document everything. I already had. My parents hired a family lawyer. Not for Danielle, for themselves, because someone had told them they might also have some exposure. The lawyer was a man named Gerald who called me twice to suggest we could handle this quietly, within the family. I let him speak. Then I reminded him that I was a federal prosecutor and that I had reported the crime to law enforcement before involving the U.S. Attorney's Office professionally, which meant this was squarely within the jurisdiction of the civil legal system and outside the territory of family preference. He didn't call back. Danielle hired her own lawyer. She sent me a text through him forwarded without comment that said she was prepared to make full restitution and was requesting that I drop the charges in the interest of family unity. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to the detective and to my supervisor. The arraignment was on a Thursday morning. I drove myself. My mother had left 3 voicemails the night before, each one slightly more emotional than the last, each one carefully constructed to make me feel like the person who had broken something. The last one ended with, "I just hope you can look back on this someday and feel good about it." I saved all 3. The courthouse in Greensboro was smaller than the federal courthouse in Charlotte, where I spent most of my professional life. The ceilings were lower, the lighting was more forgiving. Danielle arrived with her lawyer and sat across the aisle with my mother, who had come despite saying she wouldn't. My father had stayed home. I chose to believe that was a decision rather than an absence. The judge was a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the particular economy of movement that comes from having seen too many people waste her time. She reviewed the file. She did not appear moved by Danielle's lawyer's opening remarks about family stress and financial hardship and a momentary lapse in judgment. When she looked up, she looked directly at Danielle. "You're aware," she said, "that the victim in this case is an attorney employed by the federal government." Danielle's lawyer answered for her. "We're aware, Your Honor. We believe the relationship between the parties." The judge held up one hand. "I'm asking your client." Danielle looked at the judge and said yes. "And you proceeded anyway." It was a statement, not a question. Danielle didn't answer. Her lawyer touched her arm. The judge looked back at the file. "The documentation here is thorough," she said. "Bank records, teller statement, identification used at the branch, handwriting comparison from the bank's fraud unit. I don't see a lot of room for interpretation." Danielle's lawyer tried again. "Your Honor, my client is prepared to make full restitution and is willing to participate in a diversion program." "That's something to discuss at sentencing," the judge said. "Today, we're establishing the facts." She looked at Danielle one more time. The look wasn't angry. It was the look of someone who had been doing this long enough to recognize the exact shape of a person who had never once been held accountable for anything. For the record, the judge said, this court finds probable cause to proceed on both counts: check fraud and criminal impersonation. Bail is set. Preliminary hearing in 3 weeks. My mother made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound. The kind that comes from somewhere behind language. Danielle turned and looked at me across the aisle. Her expression was something I hadn't seen before, not anger, not defiance. It was genuine disbelief, the disbelief of someone who had expected the world to bend and had just discovered it wasn't going to. I looked back at her. I didn't have anything to say. Everything that needed to be said was in the judge's file. Outside the courthouse, my mother caught up to me on the steps. She reached for my arm. Claire. Please. This isn't who we are. I stopped walking. I turned to look at her, really look at her. This woman who had loved both of her daughters but had spent 40 years showing that love in ways that taught one of us the world was safe and taught the other that she was on her own. Mom, I said carefully, this is exactly who we are. This is what happens when you spend 20 years telling someone that nothing has consequences. Her face went tight. I never told her that. You told her with your silence. Every time. When she broke things and you fixed them. When she borrowed and you covered. When she lied and you helped her find a better word for it. She looked away. Her hands were shaking slightly. I had never said any of this out loud before. Not because I didn't know it, I had known it for years, the way you know something that lives in the body before it ever reaches the mouth. I just hadn't decided until now that knowing it silently wasn't enough. I don't expect you to agree with me, I said. But I need you to understand that I love you and I'm still not changing my answer. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes. The courthouse was quiet now, the morning session had cleared out, and the parking lot was almost empty. I put both hands on the steering wheel and breathed. Then I put the car in drive and headed back to Charlotte. The sentencing came 6 weeks later. I was not required to attend, but I did. I sat in the back, not at the table, not as a professional, just as a person who wanted to see the thing through. Danielle had taken a plea agreement. Her lawyer had negotiated it down to a single count of check fraud. She received 18 months of supervised probation, a fine, mandatory financial counseling, and full restitution, the $6,200, plus the bank's processing fees, plus the cost of the fraud investigation. The restitution was to be paid within 90 days, or the probation terms would escalate. The judge, before closing, looked at Danielle and said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "The law is not something that applies to other people. It applies to everyone equally, including people who believe they have reasons. You may have had reasons. They were not sufficient." Danielle nodded. She looked smaller than she had at the arraignment. Not broken. I don't think Danielle had enough self-awareness to be broken by this, but compressed, like something had pressed down on her from above and she was still figuring out the shape of it. My mother did not speak to me for 11 weeks. I know because I counted. I counted because I wanted to be honest with myself about what it cost me not to let it change my answer, but to hold it without pretending it was easy. It wasn't easy. I want to be clear about that. There is a version of this story people expect, where the person who did the right thing feels righteous and whole and vindicated. That was not my experience. My experience was driving back to Charlotte on a Tuesday afternoon with a dull ache behind my sternum and a refrigerator I had forgotten to restock before my leave. My experience was going back to work on a Wednesday and reviewing case files that felt eerily familiar because family fraud was not uncommon, not even a little. My experience was calling my father on a Sunday and having him pick up and say, "Hey, kid," which told me everything I needed to know about where he stood without either of us having to say it out loud. He was not punishing me. He was not siding with Danielle. He was just a man who had spent 40 years in a house where keeping the peace was the highest value, and he was doing the only thing he knew how to do, surviving without choosing. I told him I missed him. He said he missed me too. We talked for 20 minutes about his physical therapy and a show he'd been watching. Before he hung up, he said, "Your mother's going to come around." And then, after a pause, "You did the right thing." It came out quiet, almost casual, like he'd been holding it at the back of his mouth, and just let it drop. I thanked him. We said goodbye. The restitution was paid on day 87 of 90. A bank transfer, no note. I confirmed receipt, forwarded the confirmation to the court, and marked the case closed in my personal records. Danielle sent a text 3 days after that. It said, "I hope you're satisfied." I read it, set my phone face down on my desk, and let it stay that way for the rest of the afternoon. Later that evening, I typed a reply. I looked at it for a while. Then I deleted it without sending. There was nothing to say that the court hadn't already said better and more permanently. My mother called the following month. She didn't apologize, not exactly, but she said she'd been thinking, and that she understood I felt like I had no choice, and that she hoped we could find a way forward. It was the closest thing to accountability she was capable of. I accepted it for what it was. Not enough, but real. We talk now, my mother and I. On the phone mostly. The relationship is quieter than it used to be, which I think we both know means it's more honest. She asks about my cases, not the details, just how I'm doing. I ask about my father's knee. We do not talk about Danielle unless one of us brings it up, which we rarely do. I went back to work and I stayed at work and I got better at it, incrementally and without announcement. My supervisor mentioned my name for a senior position in the economic crimes unit. I applied. I got it. My apartment now has real furniture. Not the provisional stuff I'd been living with for 3 years while I told myself I was still figuring things out. I bought a couch that faces a window. On clear mornings, I drink coffee and watch the light move across the wall. There is a scar where the thing happened, not a physical one, but the kind that lives in how you pause before you answer your phone when the area code is familiar. The kind that makes you check your financial accounts more often than you probably need to. I don't think that's damage. I think that's just the record staying honest. Some people ask me, colleagues mostly, the ones who heard pieces of the story, if I regret it. Pressing charges. Not letting it stay in the family where everyone keeps telling me it belonged. I tell them what I tell myself when the question gets loud at 2 a.m. She used my name. Not just the money, she used my name. She wrote it on a line that was supposed to mean something and turned it into a transaction that served her. You don't do that to someone and call it a family matter. You do it and call it what it is, a decision. And decisions have answers. Mine did. The city is loud some nights and quiet others. I've started taking a longer route home from the office, past the park, past the farmer's market that's only there on Thursdays, past the coffee place that never has enough seating but always has exactly the right amount of noise. It adds 11 minutes to my commute. It took me a long time to understand that healing is not the absence of what happened. It's what you choose to add around it. The longer route, the real couch, the phone calls that are smaller and more true. Danielle completed her probation without incident. According to the case file, I have no real reason to check, but occasionally do. I don't know what she's doing now. I don't reach out, and she doesn't either. That's not punishment on my part, it's just the honest shape of where we ended up. My name is still on my accounts. My signature still means something. And on the days when I walk into a courtroom on behalf of people who couldn't fight back alone, I think about the Tuesday in February when I made a choice that cost me a lot and gave me something I hadn't known I was missing. Not satisfaction, not victory, just the particular, durable quiet of a person who decided what their name was worth and held the line.